Right. We are entering the 20th century. I've been pretty psyched to start assembling names for 20th century American pacifists. Extremely impressive bunch, really. You know, some of whom I knew to be pacifists, some of whom I had to be reminded about, some of whom I'm a little bit surprised to find that they're pacifists as well. I mean, when you're dealing with people like Jane Addams or Cesar Chavez or Thomas Merton or Dorothy Day, these are people worth talking about. Amazing, amazing people. Um, and let's talk about to make the transition right around the turn of the century, of the 19th to the 20th century. Let's talk about William James. And this is one that I needed reminding, right? Like I think I'd read his essay. I've read all of James. I tried to, or a lot, most of it. The Moral Equivalent of War, which is from 1910, right toward the end of his life. But I had forgotten that he calls himself a pacifist in there, and expresses many of the attitudes, and that's compatible with his politics as expressed. Although he was not a political theorist primarily, and to a large extent, we need to work out his politics from notes and also op-eds and stuff like that. He was always doing opinion pieces and editorials and articles actually on topics, current topics. One thing that's helping me a little bit with James is this book, Damn Great Empires by William James. On William James and the Politics of Pragmatism by Alexander Livingston. Fairly recent book. Portraying James the radical. Pointing out things that, now these things I did not know wherever I found this in James. I don't think these are things reported in Ralph Barton Perry's biography of James, which I read last year, 2 years ago, that James calls himself an anarchist a number of times. And he expresses his admiration for Tolstoy, and in particular this late pacifist Tolstoy of the 1890s, and he shows his familiarity with that as well. All right, so now so one thing that I did know about James, and that might be the only thing that one knows about James's political commitments, is that he was an anti-imperialist. One thing we've seen here is that the forms of pacifism and the way we express pacifism is relative to some extent to the conflicts that are going on, the war situation that is going on, So Woolman is responding to the French and Indian Wars. David Lowe Dodge is responding to the Revolution and the War of 1812. Henry Clark Wright talks about Seminole Wars. Lucretia Mott, we've seen talk about the Civil War, and and I've portrayed the Civil War as a crisis for pacifism, and so James in the 1890s, when he's developing this kind of anti-imperialist position and expressing it mostly in newspapers and letters and so on, rather than in his books, or it's not in Principles of Psychology, I don't think, which he was writing at the same time. He thinks that America is becoming, and also let's say that William James is very continuous with earlier American. He would have known Garrison, I think. His father knew Garrison. All right, so there are connections to Henry James Sr. There are connections to the original cohorts, and Henry James is kind of a radical reformer, although Henry James Sr. kind of younger than the classic reformers of early 19th century America. And Ralph Waldo Emerson was James's godfather. Okay, so uh, anyway, he's continuous, but the situation by 1890, the total transformation of the economy, the total also even transformation of military technology that is going on. The 1890s is not much like the 1840s in many, many ways. America has been transformed. Now, so we're dealing with the Spanish-American War. These are imperial adventures, I would say. The conquest of the Philippines and Guam, Pacific. These are, and you can see how someone who comes out of a kind of Emersonian thing in his head thinks that this is a terrible betrayal. Like this is a terrible decline. Like we're becoming more like England. And this was a moment where we were actually doing explicit colonialism, which is unusual, somewhat unusual in U.S. history. Like usually we're more about commercial exploitation than administering your area as a possession. All right, but we did a bunch of that, and most of it happened in the 1890s, early in 1910s. All right, and so he's a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. He's speaking against imperialism, very clearly, strongly. One thing about William James, James had the most amazing group of students at Harvard. He was Gertrude Stein's teacher. He was W.E.B. Du Bois's teacher. And they loved him. Everyone loved William James, apparently, I think. I don't know, George Santayana, it's wonderful who he taught. But one person he taught at Harvard was Teddy effing Roosevelt. And he quotes Teddy Roosevelt, and he talks about Teddy Roosevelt without saying like my student Teddy or whatever in the anti-imperialist writings all the time. Like in a way, I think what's really fueling this anti-imperialist thing, or even his moment of calling himself an anarchist and embracing Tolstoy and Kropotkin, is maybe even his guilt for teaching Teddy Roosevelt. Or I think maybe he admires Teddy Roosevelt a lot about Teddy Roosevelt. Or he knows Teddy Roosevelt is a powerful personality, okay? And he knows that Teddy Roosevelt is making a huge difference in the world. And, Teddy Roosevelt has this kind of unaccountable charisma. And people want to follow Teddy Roosevelt. And I think, James is fascinated by that phenomenon, but he's also repulsed by the violence and the warlikeness and the abstract praise of violence in Teddy Roosevelt. And this is very characteristic of the lead up to World War I as well, or the period around the turn of the century. The cult of militarism, which you see lots of people talking about and lots of people rejecting. But Teddy Roosevelt is that, like the martial virtues, or as Randolph Bourne, who I'm going to do next, says sarcastically, war is the health of the state. But, people like Hegel, but a lot of 19th century people leading up to Americans in the late 19th century thought of that as a good thing and a reason to go to war. There hadn't been a lot of war in the U.S. there for a little while. Well, that's not true. The Indian Wars were continuous, so I'm going to shut up about that. Now, one reason that I wasn't that thrilled, there's a bunch of writings to talk about and that Livingston talks about in Damn Great Empires, but I'm going to talk about the moral equivalent of war, which is an attempt to deal with this idea that war inculcates virtues and that, there's some things that we can do by war that we couldn't do otherwise. And war makes people better in some way. Boy, I think that's a awful argument, man. Like it's really, although, I don't know, there could be moments like that. I'll tell you one reason why I almost resisted reading The Moral Equivalent of War, because his argument here is that we need the moral equivalent of war. Like, okay, so I'm a pacifist now, but I recognize with Teddy that the martial virtues and stuff are significant. What about war on poverty? What about war on, inequality, he says. He starts listing problems that we should think about on a kind of war basis. And he says, is it only enmity that can motivate us? I don't think so. I think love too and all this stuff, and so we need the moral equivalent of war. Now, that's a famous phrase. Maybe it's about as famous as any phrase in James, I guess. The will to believe or something, maybe. The moral equivalent of war. But man, my whole life I've been hearing that rhetoric from everyone, all politicians, just manipulatively. Like there have been dozens of wars in my life on abstract concepts, man, on terror, on cancer, on war on, I don't know, how about war on drugs? See, that's what I can't not hear war on drugs when I hear the moral equivalent of war and shit like this. Okay. So it just became the most tired piece of manipulative tripe. All right. But rereading the essay, though, it's typical excellent James, and one of the few times that he really is out in his full lecture academic voice, and his popular audience too, on political matters and on war in particular. So this is, like I say, 1910. So we're a little bit distant now from the anti-imperialist moment, the anti-imperialist league and everything that tried to stop this in the 1890s and failed. And now we're into, well, I mean, you can hear some of the issues that are rising. Germany and Japan are heavily militarizing. Everyone seems to be aware of this in the early 20th century, Japan's militarization. I didn't quite realize that, but there it is. And there are sort of wars of conquest in Asia, or expected wars of conquest in Asia. And also, I guess what I wanted to say about Lucretia Mott was like she's already moving after the Civil War to like the 20th century, toward the 20th century context of how do we prevent war by international cooperation, by adjudication in international bodies, international law, international courts, and so on. And James is there. So like this again is a kind of like development in pacifism, responding to the conditions, even if it is an eternal truth, as these people conceive it as well. But this eternal truth has to grapple with the specific conditions. Now, I want to acknowledge that for James, there are no eternal truths. And this is not, it can't be for James. Well, I mean, it could be for James, a matter of religious faith. But I don't think, well, it might be. I don't know. I'm not sure how he thinks about that. But it's a pragmatic truth. He's not saying, I mean, he's saying, among other things, this is something we need now. Pacifism, all right. And he also says this. So, and I mean, this is, again, all right, the war against war, he says at the beginning of the moral equivalent of war. The war against war is going to be no holiday excursion or camping party. The military feelings are too deeply grounded to abdicate their place among our ideals until better substitutes are offered than the glory and shame that come to nations as well as to individuals from the ups and downs and of politics and the vicissitudes of trade. So we're not going to be able to get the same kind of motivations out of trading relations as we get out of war, or domestic politics either. There's something highly paradoxical in the modern man's relation to war. Ask all our millions, North and South, whether they would vote now to have our war for the Union expunged from history and the record of a peaceful transition to the present time, substituted for that of its marches and battles, and probably hardly a handful of eccentrics would say yes. So that one thing he's saying is he's registering still in 1910 that the heroes of the Civil War are so present and the country seems so warlike that even if I said, like, you could have this outcome but without the Civil War, people would reject that because they love even Lee and Stonewall Jackson, but also, Grant and Lincoln, and like, this is our identity now, and Sheridan, and these are our heroes. So now he goes and he does a kind of pacifist essay, albeit modern, right? Like 20th century, but historically ballasted as well, of course. He's an intellectual. History, he says. I'm going to try little bits of this, I guess. History is a bath of blood. And then he starts talking about the values represented in the Iliad. The centrality of war stories and warlike values to all of Western history from the very beginning. He talks about the nightmare of the Peloponnesian War. It's like, the powerful exact what they can, the weak grant what they must, Thucydides, and then the Athenians execute the Melians and colonize. Alexander's career, this hero, this great hero or whatever, like this legend, this myth, was piracy pure and simple. Nothing but an orgy of power and plunder, made romantic only by the character of the hero. There was no rational purpose in it. And the moment he died, his generals and governors attacked one another. The cruelty of these times was incredible. We inherit the warlike type. And for most, you can tell by the stories we tell. Or the histories that we preserve. And for most of the capacities of heroism that the human race is full of, we have to thank this cruel history. Dead men tell no tales, and if there were any tribes of other type than this, they have left no survivors. If there were peaceful peoples, they have left no survivors. But actually, there are plenty of peaceful peoples. Our ancestors have bred pugnacity into our bone and marrow, and thousands of years of peace won't breed it out of us. All right, so that's a terrible concession, and I think one typical of his time now. For a pacifist, like, we have been bred, evolved to war. So the question isn't, that's how he's setting up the idea that the purpose isn't to eliminate the warlike impulses, although he is opposed to all violence. The purpose is to redirect these impulses to something constructive in this pragmatist way. All right. In my remarks, pacifist though I am, I will refuse to speak of the bestial side of the war regime, which has already been done justice by many writers, and consider only the higher aspects of militaristic sentiment. Patriotism no one thinks discreditable, nor does anyone deny that war is the romance of history, with the most interesting thing of history. But inordinate ambitions are the soul of any patriotism, and the possibility of violent death the soul of all romance. The military patriotic and the romantic-minded everywhere, and especially the professional military class, refuse to admit for a moment that war may be a transitory phenomenon in social evolution, but he wants it to be, and he thinks it can be, William James. War, a transitory phenomenon in social evolution. It had better be. Now, he's writing before the wars of the 20th century, but he's also writing, as many people, with a premonition of war in Europe, starting in Europe, or in Asia. The notion of a sheep's paradise like that revolts. And again, this is kind of Emersonian macho-ness, American Teddy Roosevelt macho in a way. Like, this is going to be for sheep or women even. Like, it's a masculinist. But that revolts, but our higher imagination. Where would be the steeps of life, the challenges? All right. All right, I'm going to try to do some primitive editing here and add to that last clip because I had to get interrupted, as you might have heard there. We're having our house painted as we put it up for sale. All right, so I'm talking about like the kind of James' argument for a while on here is kind of masculinism. But this is a very American thing. And also, it's a rhetorically strategic thing. He's appealing to these, for one thing, these people who admire Teddy Roosevelt and feel him to be like the essence, the combative essence of the country. And he says this: militarism is the great preserver of our ideals of hardihood. And again, Roosevelt has a cult of this, is publishing books about this. And human life, the Rough Rider, and human life with no use for hardihood would be contemptible. Without risks or prizes for the darer, history would be insipid indeed. And there's a type of military character which everyone feels that the race should never cease to breed, for everyone is sensitive to its superiority. This is some pretty militaristic pacifism, but I guess I'm emphasizing that I think it's partly a rhetorical appeal at this moment. It's almost like there's a triple macho coming out at the moment where America's consolidated, the frontier is closed, that's the cliche. Like, you don't need these masculine virtues quite so much anymore, but that's when a cult emerges of them, embodied in part by Roosevelt. The duty is incumbent of keeping military character in stock. If keeping them, if not for use, then as ends in themselves and as pure pieces of perfection. He writes well, like his brother, right? So that we're better, maybe. So that Roosevelt's weaklings and mollycoddles might not end up making everything else disappear from the face of nature. Weaklings and mollycoddles, like, so we, and he's saying this is Roosevelt's basic idea. It's like, we can't have weaklings and mollycoddles here in our America. So what can we do then that doesn't involve killing and dying for no particular purpose, a la Alexander or whatever? He quotes a number of authors on war. This is The Philosophy of War by S.R. Steinmetz. War, according to this author, writes James, is an ordeal instituted by God, who weighs the nations in its balance. It is the essential form of the state, and the only function in which people can employ all their powers at once and convergently. And that is the kind of sentence, if you read it and believed it, that would nudge you toward anarchism, right? War is the essential form of the state. And I do think that's basically true. That's exactly what Tolstoy said, Lucretia Mott, and William Lloyd Garrison too. David Low Dodge, and many another. No victory is possible, save as the resultant of a totality of virtues, no defeat from which some vice or weakness is not responsible. Fidelity, cohesiveness, tenacity, heroism, conscience, education, inventiveness, economy, wealth, physical health, and vigor. there isn't a moral or intellectual point of superiority that doesn't tell. But I mean, like, I guess I'm trying to excuse him for expressing the cult of the military by, you know, it's a rhetorical strategy appealing to people who experience the cult of the military at this moment in American history. Now, toward the end of this is one of my justifications for discussing James here. He starts to get a pretty philosophical, he's more philosophical than most of the figures we've seen, of course. He's a great philosopher. In the Pantheon, in the Hall of Fame. Okay? And there are moments in this essay where you feel that in an interesting way. Right? And where he clarifies now the almost cult of the military stuff that he's been doing. Turn the fear of the enemy. He talks about the fear of the enemy. Turn the fear over as I will in my mind. It all seems to lead back to two unwillingnesses of the imagination. A nice Jamesian coinage, unwillingnesses. One aesthetic and the other moral. Unwillingness first to envisage a future in which army life with its many elements of charm, and many not, shall be forever impossible, and in which the destinies of people shall never more be decided quickly, thrillingly, and tragically, by force, but only gradually and insipidly by evolution. And secondly, unwillingness to see the supreme theater of human strenuousness closed. Right. So, I would like to see this explored in a book maybe. Like, okay, so we have the aesthetic aspects of war, and now he starts to talk about them, and the moral aspects. And we need to talk about those things explicitly and explore them and give theories of them in a way. And we need, in a pragmatic sense, to get some of the aesthetics and the ethics of war into our, he says, I'm a socialist, into our political lives to lead, to improving our lives together. Pacifists ought to enter more deeply into the aesthetical and ethical point of view of their opponents. And that's exactly what he's doing in this essay. Like, I'm a pacifist, and I am trying to enter more deeply into the aesthetical and ethical point of view of my opponents to understand why this war thing has such an enduring appeal and is so central to the culture that we've made together. But now let's start to pick out these strands and see what can be used for what, in terms of the aesthetics of war. Whew. There's something to think about. There's an idea opened up by William James. Having said thus much in preparation, I will now confess my own utopia. I devoutly believe in the reign of peace and in the gradual advent of some sort of socialistic equilibrium. The fatalistic view of the war function is to me nonsense, for I know that war making is due to definite motives and subject to prudential checks and reasonable criticisms, just like any other form of enterprise. He's a pragmatist, okay? Anything can be transformed. This is human, all right? Like everything has been transformed, and this is what we do. And when whole nations are the armies, and the science of destruction vies in intellectual refinement with the science of production, I see that war becomes absurd and impossible from its own monstrosity. Okay, so now, when we're in an industrial period of war, and he's foreseeing the wars of the 20th century, these are, he thinks at this in 1910, inconceivable. War has become inconceivable because it will just destroy the world, dude. And he's right about that. And so extravagant ambitions will have to be replaced by reasonable claims, and nations must make common cause against them. I see no reason why all this should not apply to yellow as to white countries, and I look forward to a future when the acts of war shall be formally outlawed between civilized people. And he is thinking of the case of Japan, I think. All these beliefs of mine put me firmly in the anti-military party, but I do not believe that peace ought to be or will be permanent on this globe unless states pacifically organized preserve some of the old elements of army discipline. And now, if he toyed with the idea that he was a Tolstoyan or a Kropotkinian anarchist in the 1890s, by 1910, he's not thinking that. He's thinking universal military public service. He's thinking armies to educate, armies for healthcare, armies for electrification, armies for, amelioration of what is harmful to us. And he says, like, I've seen too much wild change to really believe that this change is impossible. He might have added, like, if it is, then we won't persist. So it's, but at any rate, it's wonderful to see that one of the great American philosophers, I don't think this is true of Dewey or Peirce, the other great pragmatists, or Rorty, but it's great to see that William James. I wonder who among the great American philosophers was really literally a pacifist. All right. So that's James in two clips I'm going to try to string together here if I can figure out the tech. That's how primitive I am. Next, I think Randolph Bourne. Bourne. Bourne.